Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really nice to be part of this series with this great title. And so I want to take you through some work that my colleagues and friends and I have been doing and talk a little bit about what we know about the value of social bonds and at the same time how we have figured out what we think we understand about this. So, I've spent a lot of hours watching baboons and other monkeys in captive groups and in the field. And baboons spend a lot of time grooming each other. And this is a nice and pretty typical grooming session. It goes on for some time. Seems to feel good. We always think that it must be something like a massage. It seems to have all the sort of calming properties. And it's a sort of interesting behavior because animals groom each other. And it's a behavior in which individuals can take turns. And animals can tell each other when they want to be groomed. They have special signals that they give to one another that indicate that the other party should relax, nothing bad's going to happen, and so on. And so it's easy to observe. It's pretty easy to measure, at least in the duration. And it's also notable that the animals devote a lot of time to this behavior. And they're busy girls. They have a pretty tight energy budget because they've got to feed themselves, they've got to move from one feeding site to another, they've got to take care of their kids and save some time to rest. So the fact that the animals devote a lot of time to these kinds of activities and that they take turns and that they save time for things like grooming suggests that these behaviors are important. And we also know that they don't groom one another at random. And we'll talk about some data which shows us that. And some animals groom each other more than others. So the question is, what are they doing? Why are they doing it? And why in particular? I'm particularly interested in this idea about relationships. So why do these animals form relationships with particular partners? Okay, so this question sits within another set of questions about animals and nature. Some animals live in groups, others live most of their lives alone. So leopards and pandas are largely solitary. Meerkats and elephants are always social, always live in groups. Primates are almost always social. Almost all primates live in groups, especially when we think about the monkeys and apes. Now they live in different types of groups. So the gibbon at the lower right forms pair bonds. Gorillas form one male groups with multiple females. So different kinds of groups, but always groups, with almost no exceptions. So what I want to talk about tonight is why this particular animal that I'm pretty fond of, why baboons form social bonds. And to answer that question, we need to work through some steps. I think, actually, I have messed up here. Hold on just a second. I think we went to the bottom, which is not where I want to be. Hold on. The questions looked familiar, but they seemed out of place. So here we go. Okay, so why do animals live in groups? Why do some animals live in groups and some not live in groups? Well, some of the benefits of group life are that animals are safer from predators when they're in a group. There's safety in numbers. If they're in groups and they can, say, collectively defend resources, they might have better access to resources if they're in groups. And they also might be able to share information. But living in groups can be costly. After all, the animals with whom you are most likely to compete and have overlapping needs are members of your own species. So there's competition. If you live close to conspecifics, there's a greater risk of infectious disease. Males might be cuckolded. Other males mate with the females. Your infants might be killed by other members of your group, and you might, in some cases, be eaten. So all these things happen to animals living in groups. So these are pretty serious costs. And we normally assume that when we see sociality in nature, when we see animals in groups, it's because natural selection favors sociality because the benefits that animals get from living in groups exceed the costs. And we'd also think that natural selection should favor strategies that enable individuals to get the most out of living in groups, to get the most benefit at the least cost, to maximize that ratio. And that's really the heart of understanding variation in behavior in animals that live in groups. So how do primates deal with these things? They have the same cost-benefit problem. So how do they deal with it? Well, one thing that they do is, in some cases, they develop fighting ability. So male baboons have these ferocious canines, and those are largely for use in contests with other males. They have large body size, so primates that live on the ground and particularly susceptible to predation are big. And that's a defense against predation. It also helps with fighting. And they've got some pretty impressive weaponry. The other thing that we've begun to realize that animals do, and that primates in particular do, is that they develop social bonds. So they use their relationships with other members of their groups to help them deal with the costs of living in groups. So other group members can be your allies, or they can be your companions. And what I want to explore tonight is how that works for female baboons. Okay, and so my claim that I think the evidence supports is that forming close social bonds helps females cope with the costs of living in social groups with lots of competitors. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about baboons. Baboons are an extremely cosmopolitan species. This is the baboon range in Africa. They live in Africa, and they live almost everywhere. So all of these different colors represent different species within the genus Papio, or different subspecies depending on your taxonomic preference. But they're all very similar, and particularly for my interest, there are some common behavioral features in many of these types of baboons. So they've been extremely successful. They're spread across Africa because they manage to occupy a very diverse range of habitats. They are very adaptable in their diet and their ranging patterns. So they live in dense forests. They live in the open savanna woodlands of East Africa. They live in the Okavango Delta of Botswana, where some parts of the year they have to wade through water from one part of their home range to another. And they live in really arid places like this site in Namibia. So they're really adaptable. They're a very successful species. Okay. In the savanna baboons, the olive baboons, the yellow baboons, the chacma baboons, all live in large groups with multiple adult males, multiple adult females, and a mess of juveniles and infants. In these species, young males leave their natal groups, the groups in which they're born, when they reach puberty, and will go join another group. This is a fraught, I think, terrifying time for young males, and but something that they need to do, and they need to do that largely to avoid inbreeding. So if they stay home, many of the females in their groups will be related to them. So they leave in order to avoid inbreeding. Okay, so these young guys are going to go, maybe not yet, but sooner or later. The females, in contrast, stay in their birth groups throughout their lives. So these are two females named Sylvia and Strapi, and Sylvia is Strapi's daughter, so she's grown up in her mother's group, and now they both have young infants. So all females will stay in their birth groups throughout their lives unless the group divides. But most females will stay together, or stay in their birth groups for their whole lives. And living in the same group for a long period of time generates opportunities for developing relationships with particular partners. And so years of watching baboons enables us to say something about the nature of these relationships. And this is possible largely because of long-term projects on baboons that have been conducted at a number of sites in Africa. And tonight I'm going to talk about data that come from two sites where I've worked along with others. So one site is on the Kenya-Tanzania border. It's the site of Amboseli. And the other site is in the Moremi Delta of Botswana, in the Okavango Delta of Botswana. And one thing I want you to notice is that these sites are a long way apart, and everything I say about females at one site, I can also say about females at the other site. So we have found these remarkable convergences in behavior amongst females living at these distant locations. The Amboseli Baboon Research Project has been running since the early 1970s and is still going as we speak. It was directed originally. It was founded by Stuart and Jean Altman. It's now directed by Jean Altman and one of her former students and now colleagues, Susan Alberts. This is Susan and this is Jean. And the other site, the Moremi Baboon Project, was founded in 1977 by the late Bill Hamilton, and was running up until about 2007. And the data I'm going to talk about come from about 10 years. I can't do the math in my head so fast, but 10 to 12 years in which the project was run by Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth. So what we do when we watch baboons is that we monitor the daily lives and activities of the animals in the group for this kind of work. So all the individuals in the groups are recognized individually. They're sexed and named. They're named so we can keep track of them, and besides it gets kind of boring out there, so thinking of new names is always amusing. And we take roll. So every time you see the group, you take roll. So you record the presence or absence of individuals in the group. So you have a list and you check them off. And that allows us to keep track of births, deaths or disappearances, immigration into the group, so somebody new appears in the group, or departures from the group. For males who disperse, we can't always distinguish between deaths and emigration, but sometimes we can make educated guesses. And this is Sarah Sayel, who's one of the senior research assistants on the Amboseli Baboon project. Okay, and we also keep track of the behavior. And basically what we do is record who does what to whom and how often. And that's it. It's not rocket science. It's, you just do this day in, day out for 20 years, and then you know something. And you also can see here that we have these remarkable habituation conditions. So we can stand and watch the animals from quite close. They generally ignore us, and that's allowed us to make these high-quality observations. Okay, so I'm in an anthropology department. Most of my colleagues work on people, and they want to know who's related to who. They ask them. But we can't do that with the baboons. So what we have to do and have done over the period of years is to keep track of the pattern of births of known, named, individually recognized individuals and reconstruct their genealogies. Okay, so this is, these are just taken from my notes. So this is a female named Nanook, and she had a bunch of kids. One of whom was a surviving female named Nimi, who grew up, produced infants herself. Among, Nimi didn't have all her sons, grew up and left. If they survived, her daughter Emily, she had one surviving daughter Emily, who matured and has produced 2 kids. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, and it took something like 25 years to establish that genealogy. So the long-term records, the long-term studies are essential for being able to reconstruct family relationships. Okay. The behavioral records, once we've got them tidied up and entered onto the computer and analyzed, allow us to answer questions about patterns of relationships. So we can ask who sits together, who grooms each other, who forms alliances with one another, who fights with one another. And so I want to go through some of the important elements of the structure of females' relationships. So this result tells us, this graph tells us how strong the relationships are between different categories of kin, and compare that with non-kin. Okay, so what you see here is that mothers and daughters form particularly strong and close relationships. That means they're grooming each other, sitting together at very high rates compared to other dyads. Maternal sisters also have fairly strong relationships. Maternals, aunts, and nieces, and cousins have less strong relationships than true non-kin. But statistically, the really big effects here are mothers, daughters, and sisters. So the other thing we can do is with our data, we can try to tease out something about the nature and tenor of relationships amongst the females. So grooming is this lovely behavior because you can take turns, or at least the roles of each party can be detected. So I'm grooming you or you're grooming me. So we can calculate an index which tells us whether or not the grooming is completely one-sided. So I'm doing all the work in this relationship, or if it's fully balanced and we're each doing half. And amongst the females, what we find is that females who have very strong relationships, so they're grooming each other, sitting together a lot, have the most balanced grooming relationships. So strong relationships are also equitable relationships. And this holds both for females who are closely related and for unrelated females. So they form strong relationships with some and not others. The strong relationships tend to be quite equitable. Females also have another form of behavior which is quite interesting. So this happens in many species of primates. Two animals will form an alliance or a coalition against a common opponent. They team up. And this is very helpful because two animals are stronger and scarier than one animal, and there's power in numbers. When females form alliances or coalitions, they show strong preferences again for close relatives. So in the Amboseli population in East Africa, we've actually studied 5 groups of baboons. And in each of these groups, you see that close kin are forming coalitions more often than distant kin or non-kin. So there's a very strong kin bias in the patterns of coalitionary support amongst the females. However, and if any of you have either children or siblings, it wouldn't surprise you that kinship does not actually mean never having to say you're sorry. So kin fight. They spend a lot of time together. They get in each other's face. They fight a bunch. And in fact, it turns out sisters do fight quite a bit. So these close relationships don't protect you entirely from conflict, but they do. What happens is that the balance of interactions amongst close kin is friendlier than the balance of interactions amongst others. So this is the total number of interactions. These are the friendly ones and these are the hostile ones. Okay? And so what you can see is that for mothers and daughters in particular, the proportion of interactions that are hostile is really very small. But sisters are pretty feisty. They do fight quite a bit, and they can't be distinguished from these others. The other thing that we found from long-term data, and again, this is why having long-term data are so useful, is that these social bonds that females form, particularly the close social bonds, they're the bonds they form with their top partners, the ones they seem to spend the most time with, groom the most, these bonds are quite enduring over time. So when we looked at the long-term records, so in Amboseli, I looked at over a period of about 14 years. In Moremi, we have a period of about 7 years. We can ask, how likely are females to hold on to or maintain strong relationships with their most preferred partners? Okay, so what have I got here? What I'm asking here is, how likely is it that a given pair of females will have a very close relationship if they're together in the group here for 1 year? And so you can see that almost all the pairs of mothers and daughters that we have observed in this group had very strong bonds when they were together in the group for 1 year. Okay, and these are sisters, and these are unrelated females. So this is something that we already kind of know. So close kin tend to have very strong bonds. What these data tell us that we haven't been able to see before is that these bonds are maintained over long periods of time. So if we go here, given that a female a mother and daughter are together in the group for 3 years, how likely is it that they'll have a really strong bond during all 3 of those years? Pretty likely. And you can see that for mothers and daughters, there's not much decline. And for sisters are still quite different from unrelated females. So what this tells us is that these relationships between mothers and daughters in particular, and among sisters, which are strong from the cross-sectional data, also tend to be the relationships that last the longest. And we've just done some other analyses to tell us that this is based on females' top partners, and females' top partners are their top 3 partners, and that's somewhat arbitrary. So we've also looked at females' relationships with all the other partners, and it turns out that these 3 top partners really do seem to be somewhat special for female baboons. So that these relationships with their top partners are much more stable than their relationships with less preferred partners. So your top partners you care about, the rest doesn't seem to make as much difference. And these relationships are really distinctive because they're strong and stable. Okay, so these kind of data tell us that females are forming very close, quite equitable, supportive, tolerant, and quite stable relationships with preferred partners. The next question, this is one that has really interested us, but we weren't really sure how to get to it till recently, is how do these bonds matter to females in the short term and in the long term? We see they have these relationships, but what impact do they have? So one piece of data came from a really interesting study from the Moremi baboon population. There is a high rate of predation in Moremi, and the research group took advantage of this to ask how females reacted to the loss of one of their preferred partners. Okay, so you're in the group, you sleep in a tree at night, and sometime during the night, chaos breaks out, and it turns out in that chaos, a leopard takes your mother, daughter, or sister, and she's gone. Okay. If you lose a relative over the next week or so, your cortisol level is elevated. Now, you might think having a leopard go marauding through a tree in the middle of the night is scary for everybody. So there's also, they included a control sample of females who were in the group but didn't suffer a personal loss. And the cortisol response is elevated in females, particularly elevated in females who suffered a personal loss. Their mother, daughter, or sister disappeared that night. So this is stressful. Stress responses are mobilized in response to threats. Stress responses are adaptive. They are good for you in the short term, but sustained elevations in cortisol in stress are not good for you. They're not good for us, and they're not good for them. And it looks like having a strong and stable social network helps females cope with long-term stress. So these are data collected by Kathy Crockford and her colleagues, and they used a measure of grooming diversity. And the measure of grooming diversity, if it's low, it means you have a tight group, a tight social network. And if it's high, that means you have a loose social network. Okay? So females who are, these are females who are not pregnant, they're cycling, so they are ovulating and might get pregnant in this stage, might conceive. They may be pregnant, or they may be lactating with a young infant. So for each reproductive stage, having a tight social network, a low grooming diversity reduces your cortisol levels. So having a tight social network seems to reduce the stress of everyday life. And finally, from the point of view of evolution by natural selection, the payoff is in survival and reproduction, rearing surviving offspring. So we took our data on social relationships and we asked, how does the quality of a female's social relationships affect important components of fitness? And there are two very important components of fitness for female baboons. One is infant survival. If your infants don't survive, your genes don't survive either. And longevity. All of the things be equal, the longer you live, the more babies you have, and the more genes you have in the next generation. So this is a survivorship graph, and what we looked at was how the strength of mother's social bonds influence the survivorship of her infants. These are Moremi data. All of these patterns for the baboons we can document in duplicate from Moremi and an Amboseli, and it looks virtually the same. So having infants whose mothers have strong social bonds are more likely to survive and survive longer than infants whose mothers have weaker social bonds. And you can see this is a particularly strong effect. If your mother has strong social bonds, you are more likely to survive. And strong social bonds also enhance female longevity. So these are females that have strong and stable social bonds. This is the top third. The females who have the strongest and most stable social bonds. And they're living longer than females that have less strong and stable social bonds. So these are our mid-rank females again, and these are the lower one, the least strong and stable, have the weakest relationships. So those females are with the strong and stable bonds, are living longer. So social bonds seem to have adaptive value for female baboons. They form relationships that are close and equitable, supportive, tolerant, and stable. Sound like friends. And this is particularly characteristic of mothers and daughters. And our data from both these sites suggests that these strong and stable social bonds are good for females in terms of their reproductive success and longevity. And it looks like baboons may not be unusual. There are similar effects in other taxa, including humans. But effects of the quality of social relationships on reproductive success have also been documented in wild mice, in wild horses, and in bottlenose dolphins. And I think more data like this will probably come along. And now for a piece of data on humans. There's a huge body of literature on the effects of social bonds on, and social networks on human health. Okay? There isn't very much data of what I would call primatological style data about the actual nature of the relationships between people. So people who do this work they have huge samples, but they have very sketchy data on what people actually do with other people in their social network. But these data I really like. These data actually were put together in a paper published by my colleague Brooke Scelza, and she used data from a publicly available study of maternal infant health for Puerto Rican women. And this survey had two different measures of social support for women. Was their mother living nearby? And was their mother the primary source of help? So they asked, who's the primary source of help? Some people said my mother, some people said someone else, and they asked where the mother was living. And they also had data on pregnancy outcomes. And they had a whole bunch of other things as well. They had SCS, they had age, they had everything you could think of. But these are particularly important from my point of view. Okay, one result from this analysis that Brooke did is that mothers are the primary source of support for daughters in the first year of infant's life. Not a big surprise, but hopefully at this point should sound a little familiar. But what's really interesting about this data set is that it looks very much like the quality of the relationship between mothers and daughters matters. So if mothers are close by and the primary source of support for their daughters, there's a lower risk of low birth weight, which is a major complication for infants, and mortality of infants in the first year. So being close and having important support, being part of a woman's support system, enhances outcomes for daughters. On the other hand, if mothers are close by but not the primary sources of support, then that increases the risk of low birth weight and mortality. So it's not just being there, it looks like being there and having a good relationship is what has a positive impact on infant outcomes. And as I said, there's a really big literature that social support has a lot of health benefits. So the evidence is that having a strong and close social network reduces cardiovascular reactivity, reduces blood pressure, reduces depression, and reduces mortality. And this is a big literature. And some of the literature in this area is often correlational. So you don't know if these positive health outcomes are what generate the social activity of the individual or the other way around. But there is some data. There have been some prospective studies which strongly suggest that the direction, that the causal arrow goes from sociality to health, from having a strong social network to having better health. So we're back to this slide, which is now in its rightful place. So it looks like for a wide range of animals, from house mice all the way to humans, there are some common threads about sociality. Social life, which is an adaptation, can still be stressful to individuals. Short-term stress is adaptive, long-term stress is toxic. Close bonds help animals. Most of this work has been on females, but there's some work on males. Helps females cope with stress. So these close bonds help females somehow feel more relaxed in what can be very competitive situations. And close bonds have short-term effects on female stress responses and long-term benefits on their health and reproductive success. Now, all of this work is the product of lots of people's very hard work. And I have to acknowledge my colleagues and friends who I've worked with on these projects and who have very generously allowed me to work on some of the long-term data. So the people around the site, Susan Alberts and Jean Altman, who ran the Amboseli site, and my friends Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, and many other people who contributed to these long-term projects, which are always collaborative efforts. Okay, so I'd be happy to take your questions. I'm supposed, there's some kind of mic I'm supposed to use. Oh, you have it. You're supposed to have it. Yes, good.
You studied cortisol levels. Did you study any other hormone?
I'm sorry?
You studied cortisol levels. Did you study any other hormone
The work on hormones, which was done by other people, not me, is mainly focused on cortisol at this point in females, yeah. So the trick with cortisol is that you can extract it from feces. So this work can be done non-invasively. So all you have to do is run around and pick up baboon poop and label the tubes and bring it back to the United States and explain to the customs people why you have a suitcase full of baboon poop. And it can be done non-invasively. And some other things which are interesting can only be done from urine, which is not impossible, but a lot more difficult.
Do you notice differences in bonding behavior between mothers and male offspring, and differences with their female offspring? And do these bonding behaviors change over time as the sons get closer to moving out of the group?
I've actually looked somewhat informally at the data on relationships between mothers and daughters and mothers and sons. And when they're young, the mothers grooms them both about the same amount. The boys never groom back. And over time, mom stops grooming them so much, and the daughters start grooming back. So if the daughters get a little bit older, they start to be grooming partners. And there's actually a really sweet, I mean, it depends if you happen to have a daughter, there's a sort of sweet turnaround from early on the mother's doing more of the grooming than the daughter, and then as the mother gets older, the daughter starts grooming the mother more than vice versa. So, and those boys are on their way out. They've got other things to do besides hanging around mom. Yeah, check.
What about orangs in the sense that they're very solitary as adults, but they have strong mother-child bonds?
So orangutans are the only solitary ape, the only solitary monkey. They are, it looks like, so mothers are with their offspring until they get to be subadults, and then depending on where they are, in some places subadults tend to aggregate, and they're quite gregarious and they hang out in these gangs, but eventually as adults they will be solitary again. Daughters seem, it's pretty likely, the evidence is pretty likely that daughters establish ranges that border their mother's ranges, so that a female and her daughter, her adult daughter, will be neighbors. They form strong attachments, and the ecological, I think for what most people think is that for orangs, the benefits and costs of sociality don't work out. So they're really big, and they don't spend much time on the ground, and they're not very vulnerable to predation. So they don't really need to be in groups as much. And they don't move very fast, and they have very high energetic expenditures for travel, so they can't afford much competition. So probably orangs, I mean, they're definitely an exception, and that's probably why, something like that. Yes, separately or together.
Females that don't form as strong bonds. Is this a consequence of sort of bad luck? Mom dies, don't have daughters, or what? I mean, it seems like there should be strong selection for having daughters also, therefore, given what you told me. So what can you say about that? What happens with that?
We're not exactly sure. So if you don't have a daughter, that's bad luck for sure, and that's, I mean, there's a certain amount of demographic luck involved. It's harder for us to say is whether some females are more strongly motivated or more skilled at building these relationships than others. And we don't really know that. The likelihood of having a strong bond is strongly influenced by having close kin in the group. That's a huge effect. But there are females that don't have any close kin, and some of them do have strong bonds. Now, some of them, so that's hard for us to answer right now. We don't really know, but it's a great, it's a good question.
What are some other kinds of turn taking that you've observed?
Grooming is the main one. I mean, there is some, in the alliance formation, I could help you and then you might help me on another day. So but it's not really turn taking in the same way. And the turn taking is not that patterned in the sense that it doesn't always happen. I mean, so a lot of grooming bouts, more than half of them are single direction. But we don't know if that's because they get interrupted, but they seem to balance grooming over very long periods of time. So if you take a single bout of grooming, it's less evenly balanced than bouts accumulated over multiple days. So they seem to balance across time.
What about chimps?
What about chimps?
Yes, do you see the same kind of chimps and bonobos? Do you see the same kind of thing?
So chimps are really interesting because females disperse from their natal groups and males stay home. And males, chimps, behave in a lot of ways like female baboons. They form strong relationships with other males. They seem less dependent on kinship in forming those relationships, partly because many males don't have close male relatives in the group. And the form of those relationships is remarkably like the form of the relationships for female baboons. So they have favored partners, they groom quite equitably, they support each other, and they tend to support their favorite grooming partners more than they support other guys. So, and these relationships last a long time. But we don't yet know, nobody's done the analysis on the reproductive consequences of having those kinds of relationships. We haven't got that yet.
Does sharing of food stay in the same groups?
Sorry?
Does sharing of food stay within the same groups?
Chimps share food, but baboons don't. Baboons don't share food. It's every baboon for himself. Everybody makes their own supper. Everybody does all their own foraging. And chimps are unusual because they do share some food. There's some dispute about the nature of those interactions, but chimps are really unusual because they catch vertebrate prey. So they catch monkeys and bush pigs and other things, but mainly monkeys. And when one male makes a kill, parts of that kill are often transferred to others. Now, the nature of those interactions is subject to some debate. Not clear how voluntary the exchanges are sometimes.
Joan, when I think of friendship, I think often of bonds that are without respect to kinship. And most of your talk focused on kinship bonds, and we'd often say, or someone might say something like, this is my mother and my friend, or best friend. And if friendship by itself has such great benefits, why isn't that more uniformly beneficial across all your social groups? I mean, we think of friendships developing between strangers, right? And then growing as time goes by. I don't really see as that's not really the focus of your analysis, really. It's the focus of kinship, and it's long-term kinship bonds, that the benefits of that, which is really what you're talking about.
Yeah, I've wrestled with that a lot. Whether or not we can use what I call the F word, when we're talking about relationships when we're talking about social bonds amongst kin. And you could define friendship to exclude close kin. That's a relevant definition for us in a lot of Western societies. It might not be a good definition cross-culturally. And so some of the relationships, some of the baboons, sometimes there are unrelated pairs that form these close relationships. I don't know. It's hard to say because we can't look at each dyad, the impact of each dyad's relationships. So if you don't want to call them friendships because they're close kin, I mean, I often don't call them friendships. I just call them strong social bonds. If you don't want to call them friendships because they're close kin, then that's fine. Why don't we see, I mean, if these relationships are so important and so beneficial, why don't we see them forming between non-kin? Now, that's a great problem. And in chimpanzees actually seem to manage this a bit. So what would be really nice, and this is why the chimps are interesting, what would be really nice is to document these kinds of relationships amongst the dispersing sex, where they don't have kinship to fall back on. And there's a really interesting paper that was published last year about Assamese macaques, which live in, these guys live in Thailand, and they look very similar to the female baboons without kinship. So males form these grooming relationships with other males. The males that they groom also support them in coalitions. If you get supported in coalitions, you're more likely to get to be high-ranking, and if you get to be high-ranking, you're going to be more reproductively successful. And they can make all the links without kinship. But not very many males figure that out either. So, you know, don't know why.
Could I ask sort of quite a pragmatic question? I'm from a sort of physics and engineering background. How do you get funding for 25 years of research?
Okay, well, it's not my funding. I'm just a social parasite. These long-term studies, particularly the Amboseli study, they've been very successful in generating funding. They've had a number of very nice results that have, and the value of the long-term study is such that people are, NSF has been, and NIH have been willing to support the project because of its value. The longer it goes on, the more important it is. And it's just been a very successful project. And it is always a struggle. So the people running these projects are the real heroes because they spend, I think, you know, 3/4 of every working day, and every day is a working day, worrying about keeping them going. But the long-term studies are so important and so hard to keep going because there's no actual mechanism that says long-term studies should be supported. So every single grant proposal is a battle.
If I could interject for a second, the U.S. National Science Foundation, I think they just got to $3 million. Typically, it's been $2 million they set aside for long-term ecological studies. Now, how much is the average baseball player get? $2 million. That's the value our society places on long-term research. Yet it's through research like this that Joan's been talking about that one really can begin to understand the hard questions.
Because these guys live a long time. So the females on that, when I showed that slide of where the map where Amboseli and Moremi are, those two females on that slide, one from each site, those are both females that just died recently, that have been there, born in the early 70s, just died. So lifetime reproductive success took, takes, if you're a baboon, takes 20, 30 years to sort out.
Other questions? Why don't we thank Joan? We're going to have a little reception outside. And thanks for coming tonight. And hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.